The Handley Page Halifax was a British four-engine, twin-tailed heavy bomber of the Second World War. Nicknamed the Hallybag, it entered service with the RAF on the 13th of November 1940. It had an inauspicious start, as its low service ceiling and rather ordinary flight performance made it particularly vulnerable. But with the introduction of the Mark III variant, it found its stride. The Halifax shared with the Lancaster the major burden of Bomber Command's night bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. But unlike the Lancaster, which only served as a bomber during the war, the Halifax was used extensively on other duties, including glider tug, agent-dropping transport, and general reconnaissance aircraft in Costal Command. With 6,176 aircraft built, it flew in the European theatre, in the Middle East, and later in the Far East, albeit to little effect. Operated primarily by the Royal Air Force, they also served with the Australian and Canadian Royal Air Forces, Free French Air Force, and Polish forces, and after World War II by the Royal Egyptian Air Force, the French Armée de l'Air, and the Royal Pakistan Air Force. Remaining in service decades after the war, production of the Halifax ended in April 1945. During their service with British Bomber Command, Halifaxes flew 82,773 operations and dropped approximately 227,000 tons of bombs, more than a quarter of all bombs dropped on Germany by the Royal Air Force. Initially conceived as a medium twin-engine bomber under Specification P 1336, issued by the Air Ministry on the 8th of September 1936. Led by lead designer George Volkert, Handley Page submitted their HP 56 proposal, as per the specification. The submission was a twin-engine design utilizing the Rolls-Royce Vulture engine. Losing to the Avro 679 competitor design in February 1937, the Air Ministry selected Handley Page's HP 56 bid as a second string option. Thus, in April of that year, the Air Ministry ordered 2 prototypes of each design. Unfortunately, it very soon became apparent the Vulture engines, essentially 2 Rolls-Royce Peregrine engines stitched together, would be unable to achieve its original design to produce 1,750 horsepower. As well, the Vulture suffered from frequent failures of the connecting rod big end bearings, which was found to be caused by a breakdown in lubrication and heat dissipation problems. Handley Page, wisely, and perhaps spurred by the Air Ministry's emergent favourable inclination for strategic bombing, modified their design to be a heavy bomber powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Under a new Air Ministry request B 1336, Handley Page presented its new design, known as the HP 57, and production of a pair of prototypes was approved in March 1938. Interestingly, they also provided a backup design using Bristol Hercules air-cooled radials. More on that later. Regardless, such was the promise of the HP 57 that 100 Mark I Halifaxes were ordered off the drawing board in January 1938. The first prototype, serial number L7244, made its maiden flight just 1 month after the start of the war on the 25th of October 1939, flying from RAF Bicester. 10 months later, on the 18th of August 1940, the second prototype flew, now fully kitted with turrets and armaments. A little-known fact of the Halifax is that its original design only included 5 aircrew, not 7, being a pilot, second pilot, observer/navigator, and 2 wireless operators who acted as air gunners. However, it was quickly recognized that the Halifax needed a specific airman to deal with the complex fuel, oil, electric, hydraulic, and pneumatic systems, and the composition of the crew was changed to include a flight engineer. The crew compartment in a Handley Page Halifax consisted of an upper deck to accommodate the pilot, second pilot, and flight engineer, and a lower deck for the wireless operator, observer, navigator, and air bomber. Air gunner positions evolved, with the later versions accommodating them in a mid and rear turret. Then, in February 1942, Bomber Command, due to a lack of numbers, reluctantly conceded to flying the heavy bombers with only one pilot. However, it stipulated that the aircraft must have automatic pilots, and flight engineers on Halifaxes should be capable of bringing the aircraft back in an emergency. In addition, it stated that the number of pilots on each squadron should be increased from 20 to 26 to enable pilots to get operational experience before they took charge of an aircraft. Inexperienced pilots would stand as a passenger behind an experienced pilot and watch what happens on a real operation. They were known as second dickies. But I digress. Despite less than expected performance from the prototypes, the testing was seemingly moot. Production was already underway at Handley Page's factory at Cricklewood and at English Electric's site in Samlesbury, Lancashire. The Halifax was designed modularly, with a set of sub-assemblies being built individually and then pieced together in final assembly. The modular construction permitted more rapid construction, straightforward road transport of sub-assemblies, and relative ease of repair. The wings had one-piece slotted flaps inboard and the fabric-covered ailerons outboard. Early production had wing leading-edge slats, but they were deleted early on to permit the fitting of barrage balloon cable cutters. The twin-fin tail was of conventional arrangement, with rudders and elevators. Tail fins were straight in the rear and triangular in the front, an arrangement distinctive of early Mark Halifaxes. However, it was discovered the triangular shape of the fins could result in the aircraft entering an uncontrollable spin when the aircraft was fully loaded. As a result of much testing, these fins were replaced with rectangular and larger fins. In aircraft produced after the early part of 1943, these new fins were used, and older models were retrofitted. While the bomber tailwheel landing gear was actually designed to be retractable, the retracting system proved highly unreliable, and the decision was made to lock it down. In a historical tidbit, despite the first production machine flying on the 11th of October 1940, the Halifax was not officially named so until September 1941. As was the convention for heavy bombers, it was named after a major town, in this case Halifax in the West Riding of Yorkshire. The reason for the delay being that it was a public secret at that time, the aircraft finally being announced to the world in July 1941, soon after its first operation in the war. Despite the official designation, the first Halifax units were delivered to No. 35 RAF Squadron in November 1940. The Mark I was 70 feet 1 inch long, stood 20 feet 9 inches high, had a wingspan of 98 feet 10 inches, and a wing area of 1,250 square feet. Powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin, 10 V12 water-cooled engines providing 1,145 horsepower each, it had a maximum speed of 260 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 18,000 feet, and a range of 1,000 miles under maximum load. Its defensive armament consisted of 2 Browning 303 caliber machine guns in a Bolton Paul C Mark II nose turret, 4 Browning 303 machine guns in a Bolton Paul C Mark I tail turret, and 2 303 Vickers K machine guns on pintle mounts, each side of the rear fuselage. It could carry 13,000 pounds of bombs in its 22 feet long bay and 6 bomb cells in the wings. Auxiliary fuel tanks could also be fitted in the bomb bay for ferry flights or for long-range missions with reduced bomb load. It indeed had a less than desirable performance, particularly a dangerously low ceiling, which made it more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, and in a few cases also made it the unintended target of Lancasters dropping bombs overhead. Under pressure, the Halifax design team, George Volkert and Gustav Lachmann, were quick to try and address its lackluster qualities. The initial order of 100 Mark I's consisted of 3 series, the third of which introduced an increased 18% fuel capacity, and larger oil coolers to accept new 1250 horsepower Merlin 20 engines, as well mounting twin 303 Browning machine guns in a Boulton-Paul C Mark III dorsal turret, replacing the beam guns. Iteration and experimentation continued. The Mark II Series 1 achieved some improved performance by removing the nose and dorsal turrets. The Mark II Series 1A introduced a molded perspex nose, the standard for future Halifax variants, a 4-gun Defiant-type dorsal turret, Merlin 22 engines, and larger, trapezoidal-shaped vertical tail surfaces, which solved the aforementioned control deficiencies caused by the triangular ones. Design alterations continued until the Mark II Series 2 prototype was produced and quickly discounted. With about 200 Mark IIs built and little real progress in performance, it was time to consider a radical departure in design. As noted, Handley Page engineers had considered air-cooled radial power plants, including the 14-cylinder 2-row Bristol Hercules, in their original conception. And given that the Merlin was in strong demand for the Lancaster and other highly desirable RAF aircraft like the Spitfire, the development of a Hercules-powered Halifax seemed a worthy exercise. In fact, it's highly likely at this point that it was only the time delay and cost of retooling factories that prevented the cancellation of the Halifax and Handley Page being ordered to produce Lancasters. But it was a gamble that paid off. The HP 61 Halifax, Mark III, now fitted with 1,615 horsepower, Bristol Hercules 16 radial engines, coupled with a 5 feet 4-inch increase in wingspan, now gave the craft a top speed of 282 miles per hour, and importantly, a vastly improved service ceiling of 24,000 feet. More fuel tankage increased its range to 1,860 miles. Structural reinforcements and stronger landing gear were applied to handle the higher weight, and the tailwheel was finally made properly retractable. With 2,091 machines built, the most produced variant, the Halifax Mark III, entered service on the 3rd of November 1943 with No. 433 Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force and No. 466 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force. With 904 units built, the Mark V was actually a derivative of the Mark II, and despite its slightly inferior performance due to the use of non-standard parts like the landing gear, it played an important role in operational training and coastal defense for anti-submarine warfare, reconnaissance, and meteorological roles. These modified GR Mark IIs were equipped with ASV Mark III radar and a fixed forward-firing 50 caliber gun to suppress the flak guns of a U-boat. While armament could consist of up to 8 250-pound depth charges and then 600-pound anti-submarine bombs from 1944 onwards, the Halifaxes considerably hindered U-boat activities by forcing them to dive, but actual sinkings were rare. And while Costal Command was particularly interested in obtaining Hercules-powered Halifax Mark III machines for patrols, Bomber Command preferred to reserve them for its own use. The GR Mark III, a variant of the Halifax bomber specifically adapted for maritime reconnaissance and anti-submarine warfare, did enter Coastal Command service in early 1945, but so late in the war that of course they had short service lives. Some Mark VI bombers also served as general reconnaissance patrol aircraft for a brief period after the end of the war in Europe. The Halifax Mark VI was a significant improvement over its predecessors, primarily powered by Bristol Hercules 100 engines, providing even better high-altitude performance and greater fuel capacity. A total of 466 Mark VI bombers were built. The remaining variants were the C Mark 8 unarmed transport with an 8,000-pound cargo pannier instead of a bomb bay and space for 11 passengers, and the Mark A9 paratrooper transport with space for 16 paratroopers and their gear. A transport/cargo version of the Halifax was also produced, known as the Handley Page Halton. Say whatever you want about the Halifax, she was a remarkably versatile craft. But of course, when introduced, with No. 35 Squadron RAF receiving their Mark Is on the 13th of November 1940, they were committed heavy bombers. It was just 4 months later, on the 11th of March 1941, when the Halifax was used operationally for the first time when 6 took part in an attack on Le Havre, France. A daylight raid over Hamburg, Germany, followed on the 13th of March 1941, but with a mounting and serious casualty rate due to its limited service ceiling and lack of armour. At the end of 1941, the Halifax was withdrawn from daylight bombing. Even with the introduction of the Mark III and its improved flight capabilities, Air Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command Arthur Harris held it in low regard in comparison to the Lancaster. Primary of Harris's criticism was simply the Halifax's smaller payload could not fulfill what he believed was required to fulfill the area bombing directive issued by the British Air Ministry on the 5th of February 1942. For context, it was calculated that an average Halifax would drop 100 tons of bombs in its lifetime compared to a Lancaster's 154 tons. As always, professionals use logistics to win the war. To fully appreciate Harris's point of view, one must understand the success of Operation Gomorrah, a campaign of air raids on Hamburg, which began on the 24th of July 1943 and lasted for 8 days and 7 nights. It was at the time the heaviest assault in the history of aerial warfare and was later called the Hiroshima of Germany by British officials. The industrial losses were severe. Hamburg never recovered to full production. German sources indicate that 183 large factories were destroyed out of 524 and 4,118 smaller factories out of 9,068 were destroyed. As well as the infrastructure damage, the effects on the citizens were devastating. Approximately 37,000 killed, 61% of the housing stock was destroyed or damaged, and hundreds of thousands of refugees streamed from the city. Indeed, in October 1943, Harris urged the government to be honest with the public regarding the purpose of strategic bombing. He wrote, "The aim of the combined bomber offensive should be unambiguously stated as the destruction of German cities, the killing of German workers, and the disruption of civilized life throughout Germany, the destruction of houses, public utilities, transport and lives, the creation of a refugee problem on an unprecedented scale, and the breakdown of morale both at home and at the battle fronts by fear of extended and intensified bombing are accepted and intended aims of our bombing policy. They are not byproducts of attempts to hit factories." Hence, the Lancaster was Bomber Command's preferred choice. Interestingly, No. 35 Squadron flying Halifaxes acted as pathfinders in Operation Gomorrah, guided by H-2S radar. They would find targets and mark them with oversized flares with precision. At its peak, the Halifax equipped 34 RAF Bomber Command squadrons in Europe, plus 4 in the Middle East, along with more squadrons in the Far East, which were built up after the surrender of Germany for the final assault on the Japanese, although ultimately they had little if any impact in the theatre. But domination of the larger Lancaster and its sheer ability to deliver payloads would see the Halifax mostly replaced in the heavy bomber role, and all new bomber production to concentrate on the Lancaster. But even still, it became perhaps one of the most useful aircraft of the RAF. And remember, while the ultimate full load of bombs carried by the Halifax during the war was only about a third of that carried by the Lancaster, it was still more than dropped by all other RAF bombers combined. Lastly, while the Halifax ultimate loss rate was higher, about 1 Halifax per 21 sorties versus about 1 Lancaster per 27 sorties. This statistic was skewed by high losses of Halifaxes in the early days of the war. The Halifax was in combat service about a year before the Lancaster became a real force. flying at a much lower altitude until the introduction of the Mark III. And the odds of surviving being shot down in a Halifax were almost twice as great as they were for a Lancaster. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and hit the like button. If you would like to see more like this, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Hurrah for now.